I'm Sue Ellen, and I'm from Maple Grove.
Hey, did you know as a resident of Maple Grove, you have an all-access pass to Northwest Community Television? You can produce your own show or help other residents create theirs.
I've decided to produce BookBeat because I love books, and I like learning about authors and learning about book clubs, and it's just really fun.
Ready to produce your own show? Visit nwct.org. Get your all-access pass today.
Join us for BookBeat, Sunday at 5 p.m., repeated Monday at 1 a.m. and 9 a.m. Our guest is Charles Gibson, author of Taking the Cross. See you then. Hello and welcome to BookBeat. Today our guest is Charles Gibson, author of Taking the Cross. Hello, Charles. Thank you for coming today.
Hello. Thank you. Thank you for having me here.
This book, Taking the Cross, is a very interesting book, and I wonder if you could tell us how you came to write the book.
Well, I've always loved history, and I've also always loved writing. And so about 15 years ago, I decided I wanted to do freelance writing. And my first stories that I published were for a book series called God Allows U-Turns. And it's like Chicken Soup for the Soul. And the creator of that series is from Minnesota. And so I got to meet her, and I got to go to some of her book signing events at local bookstores. And by the time I had my second book published in that series, her name's Allison Bakke. She had just written her first novel. And so we were at a signing at a bookstore in Burnsville, and she turned to me and said, "So when are you going to write a novel?" And I had actually had this idea that had been forming in my mind just over the last couple weeks. So I told her about it, and she said she would send it to her publisher. And they were initially excited about it. That publisher ended up not publishing my book, but it spurred me on to actually write the book. And I realized that if I was going to get published, I had to finish the whole thing. So that was kind of what initially spurred me on. So that was about 9 years ago to start writing this novel. I had never envisioned myself writing fiction. I had always planned to do nonfiction like travel writing or, write magazine articles. And I've published a couple stories in this series that I mentioned and also written for a local newspaper. But that was kind of the end of the series of events that led me to start writing fiction.
Excellent. Talk a little bit about your background.
So I'm married. I've been married to my wife Tricia for about 20 years. We celebrated our 20th anniversary last summer. We have two boys. They're 11 and 6. My background, I went to school for psychology, actually. So I actually got my bachelor's and master's in psychology. And along the way, actually both as an undergraduate and in graduate school, I wrote several long papers. And I realized doing that I liked the research and I liked the writing. And so I've also always been interested in history. So like I mentioned to you before, I had read encyclopedias as a kid. So I would read about different places and different countries and the history. And so that was just an interest to me that I would do on my own. And over time, like I said, I got my bachelor's and master's in psychology, and I realized that I liked writing better. And at the same time, they changed the licensing laws in the state of Minnesota so that you have to have a doctorate to get licensed as a psychologist. So I actually applied to graduate school to a doctoral program. I tried twice to get in, and when they changed the laws, the number of applications into doctoral programs just shot up. So it became really hard to get in. So it was around that time, kind of the late 90s, I decided I was going to pursue freelance writing. So
That's an interesting angle of how you got to that.
Yeah, psychology to write. Yeah, but that's
that's
kind of how it worked.
That's very interesting. What was the inspiration for Taking the Cross?
Like I mentioned, I've always loved history. I love to read about history. And when I was in college, I came across a book about this crusade that took place in Europe, crusade against heresy, and it was called which is a long name, but the Albigensian Crusade. So it was targeted a particular group of folks that lived in a city called Albi in France. And I read several other books about this crusade. It was a period of history I'd never heard about before, and I read more about it, found out that this was actually when the Inquisition started. So this crusade actually led to the Inquisition, and I read about several of the religious groups that were, existed at this time that I'd never heard of. And so it was a fascinating history, and it kind of led me to a place where I started to wonder, when we have this situation where we have Christians, basically Christians against Christians. So for the most part, this crusade was Catholics against Catholics. And you have a situation where Christians are battling against Christians. What does that mean? Where is kind of true Christianity in the middle of that? What does that mean to be a Christian when you have this, this conflict, this holy war? And so that's kind of what spurred me on to look deeper, into this time, which is very confusing spiritually. Where do you stand, and kind of where's God and all of that. And so those are some of the things that I wrestled with as I wrote the book.
Do you see any parallels with what's going on today with Christians and Muslims and other religions fighting wars for the sake of religion?
It's interesting because there are definitely some parallels. I mean, some of the battles we're fighting today were the same battles that were being fought during the Crusades. And so, and the Crusades are really interesting because as a whole, they're a very mixed bag. So the Crusades started out as, essentially a defensive conflict in Europe, and then obviously it led to some atrocities. So I mean, there's definitely some parallels, but this crusade was kind of a unique experience for the Middle Ages, and then even for what we face today.
Why is it different?
Well, I think I see it as different primarily because you have the Christians fighting Christians, and I guess we see some of that. I mean, I guess you see some of those conflicts too in like Northern Ireland and other places. So I think what it stems from is, a belief that, your particular denomination or your particular, strain of Christianity is better than, another. You have an angle on it, whereas I look at it as, the basic or true Christianity is having a relationship with Jesus Christ and belief in God, and that's the founding. And so sometimes we have other beliefs around that we fight about, either fight about or how the religion should be practiced. And that was very much the case during this time period.
Oh, that is very interesting, and your perspective on it as it relates to today is very insightful. Can you talk about the setting? You mentioned Albi in France. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so the region where the crusade took place was called the Languedoc, and that's basically what is now south-central France. And the book also takes place in Provence, which is southeast France. So these two regions that were right next to each other. And in the early 13th century, when taking the cross takes place, those two regions really weren't part of France. So technically, the nobles in that region were vassals of the king of France, but they really owed allegiance to the king of northern Spain, or the king of Aragon. And so this time period was very important in the history of France politically, because France was not a whole nation, and so the people that lived there, they spoke a different language. They didn't speak French, and they didn't consider themselves part of the French kingdom. And so the city of Albi was a city where there was a group, that's where the term Albigensian comes from. So it was a group, they're also known as Cathars, and they believed very differently than what the Catholic Church believed in, in Christianity in general. And so that was the impetus for this crusade after they had sent people to try to proselytize and convert the Albigensians. And there was another group during this time period called the Waldensians. And they came from the city of Lyon, which is to the north of France. And their beliefs were, for the most part, the same as the Catholic Church. They differed on some things like the use of relics and infant baptism, but they wanted to preach in public. So during this time, most people were illiterate, And there was actually very little preaching or even teaching of the Bible that went on in the church. So most priests were illiterate during this time, and so the Waldensians felt called to preach. And so they had, sought the Pope and the bishop to try to get permission to preach in public, and they were denied. And so that's kind of what drove them to become kind of a splinter group. So it was these two groups that were primarily targeted by this crusade. So it was one group that had beliefs that were very different from the Catholic Church. Probably actually their beliefs are maybe closer to Buddhism or another group called Manichaeanism. So it's very different. But and then there was the Waldensians who had the beliefs similar to the Catholic Church, but practiced their faith very differently.
Was the say the word again.
Albigensian.
Albigensian. Were the Albigensians wanting to read the word in the vernacular? Were there, or was that later that happened?
No, they did. So they did read the word. So both the Waldensians and the Albigensians had the New Testament in vernacular, in particular. So in the common tongue, which was a language called Occitan that they spoke, which was closer to Spanish than French. So yes, both these groups had translated the Bible into the common language.
Interesting. The Albigensians, could you say a little bit more about what their beliefs were that made them different from the Catholic Church?
Right. So they were what would be known as dualists. So they believed that there was two gods, that there was one God that created spirit, that was the good God, and there was another God that had created the earth. So they essentially believed that God had created spirit and that the devil essentially had created the earth. And so they believed that the soul was essentially trapped in the body, that the body was evil. And they also believed in reincarnation and the idea of like the migration of spirits. So much like Hindu or other religions, where the idea is that a spirit would kind of journey through, and if they did better in one life, they'd go to a higher life form, or otherwise they could go back. So they believed, for example, in not eating meat or killing animals, because you could be killing something that had a spirit. So. Mm-hmm. So again, very different beliefs, and so they also believed that you could become perfect, and that was their goal. And so the sort of the highest level, in the group, they were actually called perfects. Mm. So
interesting. Can you say a little bit more about the setting? You mentioned France, mm-hmm. and you mentioned that part of it was more aligned with Spanish, with Aragon. Mm-hmm. Could you talk a little bit about the setting?
Yes. So, like I said, the region where the book takes place was, in the southern part of France, close to the border of Spain. So, politically there was this tension, over this area between the Kingdom of France, which was basically in the northern part of what's now France, and then the Kingdom of Aragon, which was centered around Barcelona in northern Spain. And the nobles in this area, who one of them is Viscount Trencavel, who one of the main characters, serves under as a knight, were very independent in this area. So they gave religious freedom to their people. So this was probably the most free region in Europe during this time period. So there was a great deal more of economic freedom, religious freedom, freedom of speech. There wasn't the same type of discrimination against Jews that there was in other parts of Europe. And so it was much more something that we could relate to. It's not as free as obviously we experience today, but it was part of some of the earliest kind of freedom of religious movements, and some of the movements that eventually led to the Reformation. So,
okay.
Does that help?
Yes, it does. Could you talk about the cities where the story takes place? Albi is one of the important ones, but what about the other places that are mentioned in the book?
Right. So there's 4 main cities where taking the cross takes place. So in the Languedoc, the 2 main cities are Carcassonne, which is still standing today. I went there several years ago, and it's an amazing place. It's the largest intact medieval walled city in Europe. So it's like a fairy tale castle.
My goodness.
So yes, I was able to go there and walk around, and it's an amazing experience, and it looks, and it was a fortress. It looks impenetrable, and that was the main city of Viscount Trencavel, like I had mentioned, who was lord over this whole region that included Albi, which is not in the book, but but that was a major center for the Albigensians or the Cathars, like I mentioned. So that's where the crusade was named. And then there was also the city of Beziers. So these were all under the same nobleman, under the same viscount. And so it was, city of Beziers was the first city that was besieged by the Crusaders when they came south to attack this area. So there's basically 2 main battles in the book. There's the city of Beziers, which is the first city that came under siege, and then Carcassonne. And both Carcassonne and Beziers were very wealthy cities. And so this region was maybe the wealthiest region in Europe during this time, and also it was very populous. So these were cities that rivaled the size of like Rome or London or Paris at the time.
Oh my goodness.
So they're very populous and very wealthy, and then obviously when they came under siege, the population swelled because all the people from the countryside came to the city for protection. The other 2 cities are in Provence, so it's Avignon and Orange, and some people probably know about Avignon because about 100 years after taking cross takes place, the papacy was moved to Avignon. So my book takes place in 1209, and in the 1200s. It was in the 1300s when the papacy was moved to Avignon for like 100 years. So it's sometimes known as the Babylonian captivity of the papacy, so it was moved from Rome. So, and then the other city is Orange, and that's where the other main character, Eva, lives.
Mm-hmm. Could you talk a little bit about those characters? You mentioned Eva, and you mentioned the Viscount. First of all, was he a historical figure?
Yeah, so Viscount Raymond Roger Trencavel was an historical figure.
Okay,
Yes.
and how about the other characters, the 2 main characters?
So the 2 main characters are fictional. So there's several other characters in the book that are real historical characters, but 2 main characters are Andreas and Eva. So in the Taking the Cross, Andreas is the chatelaine to Viscount Trencavel, and what the chatelaine is like the governor of the castle. So he was like the lead knight. He was the governor of the castle and essentially the bodyguard, the main bodyguard for the Viscount. So he was like the second in command of that region. And like any knight of that time, he wanted to go to the Holy Land on crusade. That was the manic that was to go to Jerusalem and liberate the city, which had already been captured by the Crusaders, and by the time the book takes place, it had already fallen again to the Saracens. So there had been subsequent crusades to try to retake it. So instead, he ends up fighting against a crusade in his homeland, as Crusaders come and lay siege to his cities. And then the other character, Eva, lives in a community of women called a Beguinage. And so she was a Beguine. And what the Beguines were the widows and orphans, so the women and children of the men who had gone on crusade and been killed. And they formed communities starting in like the late 12th century, the late 1100s, for protection, for community and mutual provision. And I was very excited to find out about the Beguines because it gave me an opportunity to have an independent female character, because the Beguines, they would take vows, but they could also leave at any time to get married, and they could provide for themselves. They usually worked. They could own land. Some of them got to be quite wealthy. I mean, it was a very respected position. So noblemen would pay to build these communities, in return for receiving the prayers of the Beguines. And so Eva is a wood carver. And so then she works with a painter, so she carves wood for cathedrals and churches and other buildings.
Do the priests and so forth know that she's the wood carver, or is that something that is hidden?
So mostly it's hidden. There is, I think, one instance or a couple instances where the priest or bishop involved know that she is the wood carver, but primarily she works through her painter, who is a man, and primarily that's kept hidden, although it becomes less hidden as the story goes along.
She has a friend. I'm thinking about the instance in the orchard.
Clarice.
Clarice.
Yes.
Does Clarice figure prominently in the story, or does she just come in that?
She's a lesser character. She's not nearly as prominent as Eva, so she probably comes in maybe a fourth of the chapters. So she's Eva's mentor. So she's older. So Eva is 20, and her mentor would be like in her mid-30s.
I didn't pick that up. That's interesting to know.
Mm-hmm.
I knew that she was a mentor, but I didn't quite have a handle on the age.
And it's a different age scale in the Middle Ages. Often when people would get into their 30s or 40, or even 40s, that was considered quite old. So it was, it's very different. The lifespan was much shorter and relative scale. So yes, she's the one that, kind of serves to impart wisdom and, help Eva.
Are there any other characters that parallel Andreas that you'd like to talk about?
Yes, so for Andreas, there would be primarily two other characters. So there's Bertrand, who's another knight, who's maybe just a little bit older than Andreas, but he also helps serve as a voice of wisdom for Andreas, who can be a little impetuous or kind of hot-headed, kind of get carried away with his anger a little bit. And so he helps kind of befriends Andreas and kind of helps speak words of wisdom. And then there's also the Viscount Trencavel, who, as we mentioned, was an historical character, who was Andreas's lord. And so it'd be primarily those two characters that kind of serve along. And then there's another character, Anfos, who we see later in Carcassonne, the last half of the book, who again is a lesser character, and he serves under Andreas.
Could you talk a little bit about the squires that I noticed in the story? The entourage had a group of knights, and then they talked about the squires. What was the difference?
So the rank goes, so it's page, squire, and then knight. So a young boy, I can't remember the age, I think it's like 8 years old, could become a page. And the pages and squires would serve the knights. And the pages would be essentially errand boys. I mean, they might learn a little bit and do some training, but they would be at the knight's beck and call to serve them. And then when they got to a certain age, I think it was typically 14, then they could become a squire, which was essentially, a knight in training. So they would learn weaponry, armory, swordplay, how to ride horseback. So yeah, then with Andreas and the squires, there's a scene in the book where Andreas knights several squires, and it's right before a battle happens when they actually, need more knights for battle. But they're about at that age, so I think in the book they're like 16. I think that's the age that Andreas was when he became a knight as well. And so it's interesting because I researched about knights, squires being dubbed knights, and we usually think about someone tapping them on the shoulder with a sword. But actually what happened during this time period is something called the coulée, which was they would get slugged in the face, basically. It was like they would take their vows, and then the knight that was administering the vows would punch them in the nose, essentially. And the idea was, to kind of, it was a more violent time, but also so you would remember your vows. It was obviously a landmark thing. So.
Well, it was interesting. The word coulée one of the other meanings was to flow.
Mm-hmm.
And I noticed in the story, the person that Andreas performed the Kool-Aid on got a bloody nose.
Mm-hmm.
So that kind of went with
The blood flow. Yeah.
And so you've been giving the readers a taste of the plot. Would you like to read something?
Sure. Yeah. So what I was thinking I would do is, since there's two main characters, Andreas and Eva, and the story alternates back and forth between, I would read a little bit out of the first and the second chapters just to introduce both Andreas and Eva.
Perfect.
So just to give, since the story, really follows their stories. So I'm going to start out at beginning of chapter 1 about Andreas first, and then we'll go to Eva. So the story opens, it's July 18th in the year 1209. The boy did not recoil at the charge of the cavaliers. Make way! Andreas drove his snorting stallion toward the courageous youth. The filthy wretch trudged toward the charging cavalier, one barefoot step after the other. He was unflinchingly alone. All other refugees crowded in road ditches, leaned toward the trees, clutching them tightly. Make way for the Viscount, Andreas called as a stone unleashed from a catapult. He was accustomed to having others move with speed at his command, as if a boulder soared down upon their heads. Andreas waved his arm furiously, gesturing toward the tree line. Still the boy plodded along the road with uncovered feet, skin on rock. A darkened mist seemed to enshroud his very soul. Since cockcrow and their company had made departure from Beziers, Andreas had commanded all in their path to flee the road. Each traveler and refugee, whether merchant in dyed cotton or peasant in beast-colored rags, had given deference to their noble party as expected, a wide berth to fly along the road without hindrance. Yet a little child refused to yield. Andreas felt a strong urge to ride over the boy, to send a message to any who would dare block the way. He shook the shrill thought from his mind, searched for a spot to vacate the stone-paved road. Yet, amidst the throngs of refugees massed in the shallow, grassy ditches, pressed tight against the stands of oak and poplar and beech, there was no such place. Space enough for a little one only, not an armed cavalcade of 4 and 20. Andreas drew rein on his muscular, blackish roan stallion. The horse reared, its front hooves pawed with violence. Andreas slid back against the cantle of the saddle. He raised high the lance in his right hand as the left clung tightly to the reins. All halt! He felt his face grow hot. The company came to an abrupt halt behind him, iron horseshoes grinding, sparking on ancient stone pavement. The barefoot wretch was a senseless intrusion. The front legs of his mount found the road once more. Andreas saw that the boy was playing no foolish game. In spite of the azure brilliance of the clear, high Languedoc sky, the close sight of the lad induced a quick, darkening chill, and Andreas shivered. The youngster's dark round eyes appeared sunken into his thin, sallow face. It was a countenance erratically framed by stringy, greasy black hair that hung down to his neck. His hollow gaze was fixed straight ahead at all and nothing. His undyed tunic was riven in jagged, diagonal fashion across the torso, blotted with brownish, crusty stains. A sour stench filled Andreas's nostrils, drew water from his eyes, and he turned away. The lad bore an alarming, tart odor of befouled blood and of death. But it seemed more than the smell of the unwashed. The reek seemed somehow to exude from his immortal soul itself, or even supplant it, as if the innards of the boy were being consumed by a fire unseen, a cauterized soul smoldering in a blackened cloud. The boy continued to walk. He came within a step of the forelegs of Andreas's mount. The knight drew breath to bellow at him once more. A man, seemingly the father of the boy, emerged quickly from the compacted mass of peasants on the side of the road. He harshly clamped a sizable, rough-hewn hand on the shoulder of the lad. Why had the fool not kept close vigil over his wretched child? Andreas turned his hot anger on the sullied man. Tunic tattered, red hair matted and lengthy, he looked little better kempt than the boy. Your son has detained us here, and we need reach Montpelier by nightfall. Does he lack hearing? Andreas squared his shoulders. Your Viscount is on an urgent mission. Now yield the road. Many apologies, my lords, for the insolence of the boy. The man released the words in breathless gasps, turned his weary countenance and disheveled body to face Andreas. We flee the approaching host, like all others in your sight. He waved his arm at the masses of refugees. They shuffled forward and broke like a beast-colored wave around the knights, sought not to appear as if they were watching the peculiar sight of a commoner addressing his lord on the road. Andreas thought the lot of them grubby and gaunt from the journey through a sun-scorched land where dust and moisture saturated the air. Many among them had the look of fretful exhaustion, brittle terracotta masks of fear. None seemed as the peasant lad. The hands of the man rested on the shoulders of his little boy. As you can see, my son stumbles around as one in a trance. If I may beg pardon, my lords, I will tell of all that has befallen us. The hands of the man trembled as he gripped tight the boy. The father was clearly fear-struck. The son was almost vacuous, a fleshy shell devoid of spirit. Continue, but speak with haste, said the rider alongside Andreas. The voice belonged to Raymond Roger Trencavel I, Viscount of Carcassonne, Albi, and Beziers. He was lord of these lands. Andreas was chatelain to the Viscount, nearly the equal in stature to Raymond Roger himself. Nearly, but not quite. The chatelain was the official given charge, among other things, for the safeguarding of the Viscount, and for the governing of the Trencavel Castle, the Chateau Comtal in Carcassonne. The English counterpart was called the Castellan. Chatelain was a position of rank rooted many centuries past in the time of the Frankish Merovingian kings. In those times, such an official had been called the mayor of the palace. Andreas the chatelain blinked his smallish hazel eyes, rubbed his straight square nose, puckered his wide mouth, and with no small difficulty stifled a deep groan at the words of his lord. For they were words that meant their company would be stationary, at least for these few moments while the villager gave voice to his woes. Andreas removed his helmet and straightened his sweat-soaked, rumpled brown hair with a black leather-gloved hand. He watched the throngs trudge by beneath him. So many flee in distress. Why lend this one his noble ear? Yet Raymond Roger was ever willing to hear from his subjects, to speak with them personally. It was a generosity he bestowed too liberally on his people. Andreas placed the burnished steel helmet back upon his head. He cursed the delay under his breath. With the armies of the north drawn near, safety lay in motion. Andreas looked up and down the straight Roman road they traveled. The Via Domitia it was called. He saw none other than those fleeing to Beziers, yet he was leery. Remaining still on the road was akin to surrender. Andreas could fight his way through any trap as long as he met the challenge at full battle charge. In Iberia, 7 years past, on the way to battle in Reconquista, the endeavor to reclaim Spain from the Mohammedan, their company had halted, at the sound of crackling from the wood at twilight. A company of Moors, twice their number, had emerged from cover and attacked with disarming speed. In their light armor and atop agile mounts, thin swords hacking and slashing, the enemy retreated before the knights of the Languedoc could give chase. The Moors had charged again from another angle and once more retreated. This was repeated thrice more until the knights were vigilant to the point of skittishness. Andreas, only 16, newly dubbed a cavalier, had grown angry. No more defenses. We attack. Who will follow? Though he lacked the authority, most were of the same mind and followed eagerly. The rest were compelled to take up the charge or be abandoned. Andreas led the attack. Raymond Roger followed. The Moors converged on the road once more. They could not withstand the galloping force of the more heavily armored knights from the Languedoc. All the Mohammedans, though their numbers were greater, were slain in the saddle or unhorsed and trampled. Upon hearing tell of the event, Andreas's father had told him only that he was reckless, that he should have known his place and kept formation. Yet Raymond Roger had given commendation to his impetuous knight. Andreas had admired his lord's frank acceptance of the usurpation of his authority. Since that day, Andreas had held charge over older men. Raymond Roger had eventually elevated him to chatelain, a position that in France was a title of heredity. He could have received no greater honor from his lord. The fact that a little boy, this day, dared defy the cavalier who had risen to be chatelain to the Viscount of Carcassonne, Albi, and Beziers was like a mouthful of raw vinegar. It set Andreas's teeth on edge.
Wonderful. That's the story of Andreas and how he got started. What about this man and his little boy? Can you talk about them a little bit? How they came into the story?
Sure. So when I first started writing Taking the Cross, I had originally started, I think, what's now chapter 3 was originally the beginning of the novel. And I realized that I wanted to have a beginning that just kind of took the reader and plunged them into the story. And so what's happening is that at the beginning of the book is that Andreas and Raymond Roger Trencavel and their whole troop of about 25 knights are riding to the city of Montpelier to meet the crusading army. So their goal is to make peace. And as they're going on this road, away from their lands and their cities, they're encountering all these refugees that are fleeing the invading army. And typically in warfare throughout history, but especially typically during the Middle Ages, when armies would come, the people would suffer. So the armies would, they would steal, plunder, pillage, and so people would flee to the cities. So that's what they were doing, and so that's who this father and his little boy are, refugees that are fleeing their village because it's already been plundered by this coming army, and they're fleeing to the city of Béziers, which is the nearest city.
Okay.
So, and then if you read on, you'll hear a little bit more about their story and their unique aspect of why they're in the book.
And now you're going to read something about Eva.
Correct. So, like I mentioned, the story alternates back and forth between Andreas and Eva. So now I'm at the beginning of chapter 2, reading about Eva. So it's also the story. Her story also starts on July 18th, 1209. Eva was happy to see the painted wicker basket was almost cram full. The fruit of one more tree would complete the day's bounty. The hollow rumbling in her belly gave reminder that the midday meal was swiftly approaching. She could afford to indulge her appetite with one pear at least. Setting down the basket, she plopped herself unceremoniously on the ground. Not a soul stood within sight. Snatching the most attractive pear from the mounding pile, she bit into the fleshy fruit. A single drop of its juice dribbled lazily down her chin, clinging to her jawline. She allowed the drop to plunge to the grass below. What a blessing to have solitude this morn. It was hot. The breeze floated lazily across the bluff, a welcome respite from the fiery white of the late morning Provençal sun. The wind gently prodded the oblong pointed leaves of the pyramid-shaped, evenly spaced pear trees into subtle movement, swaying the flimsy tops back and forth. The leaves rubbed together in cadence, like an orderly, slow-moving chain dance in a massive open hall. Eva leaned back her uncowled head, allowed her dark brown hair to fall to the middle of her back, shut her expansive, rounded eyes of the same color, and listened to the motion of leaf and branch. The sun was restful, tranquil, like her orchard. Her very orchard. Eva's eyes opened, dark long lashes separated. She breathed the landscape from cliffside to grassy slope. Breathing deeply, she drew the faintly sweet scent of the orchard into her slender nose, set evenly between high rounded cheeks, and formed her unadorned red full lips into the type of contented smile that barely raises the corners of the mouth. She finished consuming the pear, wiped her hand on her mouth, on her sleeve, raised slowly her slender feminine frame until she stood fully upon her leather sandal-shod feet. Casting aside the uneaten core, she resumed filling the large green basket. She moved to the next tree at the east end of the orchard, started to claim its ripe fruit with long, elegant, calloused fingers. Eva looked beyond the grove to the edge of the bluff, which dropped off in a vertical cliff, gave way to the valley of the river Rhone and distant lands beyond. She focused for but a moment on the marshy bank of the broad, swift-flowing Rhone, but swiftly she looked away. The ground still appeared trampled, war-pounded, invaded. The memory of what she had witnessed 3 days ago was still a raw wound, and she winced. Soldiers, knights, horses, wagons, barges, banners, overlords, rôtiers, camp followers, mercenaries, death. She turned away, gaining the more pleasing view of the community of Beguines, her home. She gazed upon the city of women from the cliff's edge, thinking of when she first arrived at age 10. That marked the midpoint of her 20-year existence. Eva felt the mid-July sun bringing warmth to her gray robe of wool, and she smiled. Truly, she was a blessed woman. She was a Beguine, a member of the Guild of Carpenters, and the holder of her own lands. She was thankful for her life as a Beguine and the freedom it brought, such incomparable liberty for a woman that had redeemed her days, afforded her the opportunity to put off marriage. Without the community of Beguines, she would have felt bound to wed one of the suitors who had sought her at age 15, a stream of marriage seekers that had gone dry by her 16th summer, for word had spread among the knights of the prince and other men of means in Orange that her beauty was exceeded only by her fire of spirit. She smiled. Yet a decision to spurn suitors generated no lack of detractors. Simple minds who believed a nubile woman of her age, when capable of bearing children, should be under the strict authority of husband or convent. How could women, weak-willed as they invariably were, maintain the vow of celibacy outside of the monastic enclosure? How could they live without the lordship of men, apart from the rule of St. Benedict? Eva smiled at the oft-raised query. Her motion did not cease as she dragged her wooden stepladder clacking across exposed roots. Stopping at the next tree, she continued filling her basket with ripe fruit. Such an unwitting attitude toward women was far less common in Provence than in the north, yet many times had she faced such rhetorical questions. Never had she even heard the term beguine until age 10, till her mother had explained they were entering a new residence. Eva had just returned from playing boule in the market plaza with other children. She was wiping the grit off her carved spheres of wood. She had returned to the arched limestone tunnels that combed the underbelly of Orange, where she encountered her mother. Her mother, with her dark hair and eyes that burned with blackened intensity, was radiant, even in the simple clothes that ever adorned her. Lydia had been still a handsome woman, even at the age of 35. She had been waiting with that expectant look, an expression that meant she had news. "You have things to say, Mère?" Eva had always looked forward to hearing such news. The words to follow did not match her expectation. "Eva, would you like to live in a new city with other children like you, girls and boys whose fathers were claimed also by war?" Her mother had spoken the words in a measured, soothing tone. Eva had thought for a moment, looked heavenward, and scrunched her nose. "I do not think so," she had replied. "I like it here in Orange, here in the house of the carpenter." "My little Para." Her mother had spoken the words with a warm smile, folded Eva into her arms. "The little city is not far, only 1/2 league hence. We will return to Orange often. Prince Guillaume has built this new city for women and their children." Her mother had taken Eva's face in her hands and had looked her directly in the eye. Eva had looked away. "We shall have our own house." Eva had stopped seeking to avert the gaze of her mother. "Our own house? That would be better than this little room, I do suppose." She had acknowledged the point thoughtfully and somewhat begrudgingly. For as long as Eva had memory, she and her mother had made residence in the sparse back room of the shop of a carpenter. Her mother had run the household of the craftsman, Henrique de Toulouse, while Eva, fascinated with woodworking, had sought to glean all she could about the trade. She had even asked Henrique if she could accompany him to a meet of the Guild of Carpenters. At first he had simply laughed and tousled her hair, which had annoyed her. But she had been persistent, and he had relented. By the age of 10, she knew not only how to use the tools of a carpenter, how to work the wood into realities that fit her imaginings, but had learned much of the economics of the trade as well, including the workings and politics of the guild. Henrique had been given the title de Toulouse in jest, only because of his pompousness and not through any noble claim. He indeed hailed from Toulouse, but possessed not a drop of high-born blood. Yet he could display a noble penchant for generosity. While Eva had bit her lip to hold back a smile, Henrique had remarked more than once in a huff about the futility of standing between her and what she sought.
Oh, how fun. There's another character that that appears in the book after Eva speaks to the painter, and there's a cleric that comes.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about him?
Yes. So he is a tie to Eva's past. So he has been seeking Eva for a long time. So I'll tell a little bit, hopefully without giving too much away.
Please.
So the cleric that comes is the Bishop of Siena. So yes, Siena is a city in Italy. It's actually still intact in its medieval form. And like the Languedoc, Siena was also it was a free city. It was run by the people. So again, some of the more free regions of Europe. And he has been seeking Eva for years. Eva's father had gone on crusade. So this is the reason that Eva and her mother were beguines. Her father had gone on crusade to the Holy Land and been killed during the siege of a city about 20 years, so I guess probably some 17, 18 years before. And this bishop, whose name is Pietro, was a priest that also had gone to the Holy Land on crusade, and so he knew Eva's father. And so he pens a letter basically informing Eva and her mother of their father's death in the Holy Land. And he realizes that Eva is in danger because of some things that her father learned in the Holy Land. And so he comes to seek her after all this time. And so when he finally finds her in the beginning, I think it's in the 8th chapter, he has sought her for, I think it's, 15 years.
Oh my goodness.
And has finally found her.
Oh. I really enjoy delving into the various characters. I really enjoyed what you had to say. I wanted to find out if there's anything else you'd like to tell us about the book or about the other work that you're doing.
Sure. So one thing that I mentioned that I found really interesting as I did research is just the historical context and how the more I researched and read about the Middle Ages, the more alive that it came. I mean, typically we hear about the Middle Ages as, a time where there was basically like nobles, peasants, and clerics. And most people were oppressed and illiterate, which they were, but in different regions of Europe, like where my book takes place, there was a movement toward freedom. And so it was fascinating to hear about some of these early religious movements that, like one was the Waldensians, who persisted through persecution for 300 years and eventually joined the Reformation, is one group. Another group was the Beguines, like I mentioned, who had communities that started in the 1100s and had communities for probably about 100 years until they fell under persecution. So that was interesting. Today's saint sometimes is tomorrow's heretic. In the kind of the political winds.
Interesting. You mentioned that you have another book.
Yes. So when I submitted Taking the Cross to my publisher, they finally accepted it. The story was originally 600 pages. So I had written the whole story that I had envisioned, and when they responded to me, they said, we like the book, we'd like to publish it, but it's too long for us. Can you break it in half? We try to, we typically don't publish over 300 pages. So it just happened to work that the only place that I could reasonably break the book in half was right in the middle.
Oh.
So the way the book ends, there's originally was the ending of part 1, and then the next story begins about a year later. So I've already written the second book.
Oh, well, we'll wait eagerly for that to appear. Is there anything else that I haven't asked you that you'd like to talk about? You might want to mention your publisher.
Sure. So my publisher is Kohler Books, and they are out of Virginia Beach, Virginia. And so the novel, again, is called Taking the Cross. And it's available at Barnes & Noble bookstores. And it's also available, I think it's at every Barnes & Noble in Minnesota. It's also available online on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Kobo, Books A Million, several different sites. And it's also available online in printed form as well as ebook form as well.
Oh, that's terrific. Is there anything else that you'd like to add? Can you?
There's nothing else I can think of. If you have any other
Okay.
questions, I would be open.
I really enjoyed your visit with us today. Thank you so much. Again, this is BookBeat. Thank you for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you next time. I'm trying something new today. I've got my questions on my phone. Good afternoon and welcome to Book Beat. Reading books is the key to an enlightened society. You want a key light back there, right?
Just gonna borrow this.
I think we're about ready, aren't we, Jesse? Good. Book Beat is a show about books and book readers.
A very odd combination of topics.
We interview book club members. How are your books chosen? And film their discussions.
Trying to find happiness and love in her life.
We also provide tips for forming book clubs
I think you just have to find a group of interested book readers.
and books that are current that might be enjoyable to read. In a society where everything is instantaneous, we're losing that sense of depth that reading can bring that other media doesn't. My name is Sue Ellen Zagrabelny. Well, I can't guarantee Oprah, but I can guarantee Channel 20. Look for Book Beat, Sundays at 5 p.m., repeated Monday at 1 a.m. and 9 a.m. on Channel 20. See you then.